This is a Bees and Reverie Radio podcast news short. I'm sorry if there's a little bit of wind or noise in the background, but there's an important and time-critical action element to this one where you can make a difference. So please stay tuned for these important few minutes. Last week on February 26, the House Natural Resources Committee for Water, Wildlife, and Fisheries held a hearing designed to start the attack on two of our country's most effective wildlife protection laws that have been working for decades. Using a recent Supreme Court decision as their excuse, some congressional Republicans pulled together this hearing in order to start to try to dismantle the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act. The good news, though, is that we have an opportunity here to act because polling in this country that's been done over the past couple years shows that a majority of Americans do support the Endangered Species Act. Yet, the Trump administration and some members of Congress have decided, with all the problems that they're facing right now, to take on yet another unpopular initiative to try and dismantle these important conservation laws. So, what can we do? In this news short, I'm going to cover a couple of things. One is a brief reminder about how the Endangered Species Act works and why it's important, and then I'm going to cover what we can do together right now to make a difference. There are two specific things that we can all do this week to help, and I say this week because the timing is really important, given that this hearing was just held last week. The sooner that we make noise about it, the better. So let's get into it. The Endangered Species Act, which passed in 1973, has always had pretty broad bipartisan support, both when it passed and since then. Now, there have always been some detractors, but largely the act has worked. It is acknowledged that it works, and it has pretty broad support, not just from Congress, but also from the American people. And not only support, but countless hours of work have gone into the Endangered Species Act over these 50 years to constantly update it and make sure it continues to work as intended and as the people want. There are currently over 1,500 animal and plant species in the U.S. that are protected by the Endangered Species Act. Not only does the Endangered Species Act help these currently protected species in order to give their populations a chance to recover, but the Endangered Species Act also makes sure that those threatened and endangered populations are monitored over time to determine whether, in fact, the species is recovering. Are the protections working? And when a species is considered recovered, they're removed from that list. So species do sometimes come off the list in addition to going on the list. The Endangered Species Act for decades has been viewed as a gold standard for conservation legislation. It is one of the world's most effective laws for preventing and reversing the decline of endangered and threatened wildlife. It is something we can be proud of. Because of the Endangered Species Act, people have been able to work for decades to identify and protect critical habitat for species like bald eagles, California condor, humpback whales, and more. And important plant species are also included. The way it works is that an individual or an organization can petition to have a species listed as endangered or threatened under the Endangered Species Act. These listings undergo rigorous scientific evaluation and a rigorous public review process before a final decision is made on whether a species should be protected. In fact, if you've been listening to our podcast recently, you know that right now there's a public comment period where anyone can add information and comment on a current proposal by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to list the monarch butterfly as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. On a couple of our recent podcast episodes, Emily has talked about how this proposal to protect the monarch butterflies has been over 10 years in the making, and support for monarch butterflies is not a partisan issue. And I know there's been a lot of work like this for other species and for critical habitat over the decades since passing the Endangered Species Act. To lose that now would be heartbreaking. With over 1,500 important American plant and animal species currently protected by the Endangered Species Act right now today, and when we know that once a species goes extinct, there is no coming back from that, extinction is forever, to lose that now would be heartbreaking. So, if you're with me so far, here's what we can do. Number one, and I know we hear this a lot, but there's a reason, and it's because it works. Email and call your members of Congress. Now hang on with me for just a second. Okay, most of us have 2 senators and 1 representative at the federal level, and all 3 of them represent and work for us. In the show notes for this news short, we'll have a link where you can find contact information for yours if you don't know it yet, so don't worry. You can just enter your zip code at a page at congress.gov, and we'll have that in the show notes. Okay, so what we can do this week is you can either email or call all 3 of them, and tell them that you want them to resist any attacks on the Endangered Species Act. This can be really short, just a short email or a short call where you say briefly why you care about this, and you can make it personal, or you can just make it really simple. You can say something like, I'm contacting you about the Endangered Species Act. I want it to be protected for future generations, or whatever you want to say along those lines, and then tell them what you want them to do. I'm asking you to stand up and say no to any attempt to harm the Endangered Species Act. That's it. And here's a tip for any time you email or call your federal elected representatives. Be sure to let them know you're a constituent that lives in their state or district. Give them your full name and your zip code so they know to count your opinion. And then the other thing we can do this week is get involved with an organization that is actively working right now on this issue, specifically on protecting the Endangered Species Act and U.S. wildlife. So you can sign up with the national organization, and I'm going to give you a couple of names right now, though there are also others. I recommend considering the Endangered Species Coalition and or Defenders of Wildlife. Both of these are national organizations. They've been around for a while in the trenches working on these issues, and they're active right now. They are responding to and have been creating action plans for this current attack. You can also join a local organization that's working in your county or state. You can look up your state's Native Plant Society or any environmental organization that appeals to you and that works locally. And in fact, the National Endangered Species Coalition has a list of coalition member organizations sorted by state on their website to get you started to find a local connection. So I'll put that link in the show notes as well. And so what do you do? What do I mean by get involved in these organizations? Number one, you could actually join the organization. You can make a donation, or you could volunteer. Some of them have volunteer opportunities, or even just sign up for their email action list. Agree to get emails from them, and then when you get those emails, sign on to petitions and letters when something speaks for you. All of that makes a difference. And if you find an organization that's local to you, there may be more concrete local actions that you can take as well. And I want to close by just saying why. Right now, this week, every action we take on this issue really does make a difference. It's important that even though there's a lot going on right now, we show that we are paying attention to this issue as well, that it matters to us, and that we expect our electeds to do their job for us. Our nation's wildlife and irreplaceable habitat should not be sacrificed for short-term economic gains, especially economic gains that most Americans will not only not ever benefit from, but we will be harmed by if these habitats and wildlife were to disappear. Thanks for listening. And again, you can check out the show notes if you want links to the websites that I mentioned.